Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu has become one of the most in-trend, in-vogue martial arts in recent years, thanks to the likes of the UFC and figures such as Joe Rogan. One of the most intriguing aspects of Jiu-Jitsu is that technique beats strength in many instances. Unsurprisingly, this feature of Jiu-Jitsu that allows a smaller person to beat a larger person became extremely appealing to the suffragettes in their campaign for women's voting rights in the UK. On the 18th of November 1910, a group of around 300 suffragettes were met by police and crowds outside Parliament. Things turned violent and many suffragettes were assaulted and beaten by police and men in the crowds. Many suffragettes were seriously injured and 2 even died, with over 100 also arrested. This day in history is known as Black Friday. As the campaign for women's votes increasingly became more violent, women increasingly looked for ways to defend themselves. They turned to a Japanese martial art that developed in the 1530s in Japan, known as Jiu-Jitsu. Jiu-Jitsu and the Brazilian adaptation known as Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which was developed by the Gracie brothers in around 1925 initially and then progressed and evolved from there, emphasises the use of leverage and strategy, allowing a smaller, weaker individual to beat a larger, stronger, more powerful opponent. And this was obviously highly appealing to the suffragettes. In the lead up to the First World War, Edith Garrett, a tiny woman who was only 4'11", became a Jiu-Jitsu instructor for the Women's Social and Political Union, better known as the Suffragettes. Garrett initially saw Jiu-Jitsu in action when her husband William went to a training session in 1899. She was impressed by the use of strategy and started taking lessons herself. Garrett had been running suffragette-only Jiu-Jitsu classes before Black Friday, and the need for this only intensified after the event. She had also been writing about the virtues of Jiu-Jitsu in the Women's Social and Political Union magazine newspaper titled Votes for Women, where she emphasised the use and utility of Jiu-Jitsu of a small, weaker individual beating a larger opponent. The Pankhursts themselves endorsed Jiu-Jitsu as well. Sylvia Pankhurst, the daughter of Emmeline, said in a 1913 speech, "The police know Jiu-Jitsu. I advise you to learn Jiu-Jitsu as well. Women should practice Jiu-Jitsu as well as men." With the suffragettes practicing Jiu-Jitsu, it didn't take a rocket scientist to come up with the term Suffrajitsu, which newspapers started to use quite soon after the suffragettes adopted Jiu-Jitsu in a more serious manner. Jiu-Jitsu soon became a societal trend in many respects, with upper middle class women in Britain at that point hosting Jiu-Jitsu parties, where they would invite fellow suffragettes over to take classes in Jiu-Jitsu and go through instructionals. Garrett would also go on to train a select group of women of around 30 who were known as the bodyguards. So Jiu-Jitsu itself is something I've got somewhat of a first-hand experience. I've done it on and off for a couple of years now, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which like I say is the most common variation that we see today. It's an incredible martial art, and really most martial arts trying to emphasise, the use of technique, strategy, so a smaller opponent can beat a larger opponent. In the case of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, this is actually the case in many respects. Obviously, strength and power is an advantage in any sport. But Jiu-Jitsu really, using leverage, using proper technique, you truly can control someone that's 2-3 stone heavier than you, many pounds heavier than you, taller, stronger, more physically strong, more powerful in general. You really can control them through leverage, through technique. An armbar can work on someone that's much heavier than yourself. You can submit someone, you can choke someone out unconscious, even if they're much larger opponents. So the fact that the suffragettes picked up on Jiu-Jitsu, Jiu-Jitsu at that point was more the Japanese Jiu-Jitsu. Like I say, the evolution and history of Jiu-Jitsu started as a Japanese martial art, as most martial arts obviously are Japanese, but then the Gracie brothers, which are essentially the royalty in Jiu-Jitsu, and many of the relatives, they seem to have massive families, by the way, I don't know if they were Catholic, but many of the relatives still exist today and still teach Jiu-Jitsu, but they obviously adapted it, so Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is a Gracie adaptation of the Japanese style Jiu-Jitsu. And BJJ, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, is commonly known as Gracie Jiu-Jitsu even today. There's also great Gracie Jiu-Jitsu channels out today on YouTube. The Gracie Breakdown with Henner Gracie and his brother Huron is an amazing channel I watch a lot. And I would highly recommend, if you're a woman trying to learn self-defense techniques, Gracie Breakdown's a great channel. They've got Gracie University, I think's their website as well. I'll link a couple of videos. I know he's done a couple of videos with other YouTubers on simple kind of self-defense techniques for women. So I'll link them videos because it is very worthwhile. So obviously the suffragettes, they picked up on the fact that Jiu-Jitsu wasn't just, you know, BS when it was saying that small, weaker people could defeat larger opponents. To a large degree, it is actually the case. There's a limit to that, like anything, but of all the martial arts, it's probably the one where that's actually, you know, the case. And obviously the UFC has really tested Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and it is legit. Royce Gracie, for instance, really popularised and really brought Jiu-Jitsu to the masses, Brazilian Gracie Jiu-Jitsu to the masses. And some of the initial, I think the first UFC in the 1990s, where everyone was on steroids. There wasn't any weight classes, I don't think, and he was just, you know, choking people out, submitting people, and really showing, and you know, the test of fire, the cauldron of fire, and actual live competition, the benefits and the value of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Yeah, so it's fascinating that something's really popular today that the suffragettes picked up on over a century ago. And just last night in the UFC, we saw Jiu-Jitsu, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in action. John Jones submitted his opponent, Cyril Gane, in the first round after a minute or so, or whatever it was, in some sort of unorthodox, only John Jones style guillotine he'd actually pull off. It was some sort of mounted guillotine in some sort of sit-up position. It was a really unusual way to submit someone, but John Jones, probably the GOAT, probably the greatest of all time, shows why he is. He's been out for 3 years. He's obviously went up a weight class to heavyweight, and he manages to make it look so easy. So incredible performance. But that was another instance of Jiu-Jitsu in action. Yeah, so it's quite incredible. The suffragettes were into this over 100 years ago, started this trend in Britain, and I'm sure it probably took root in many other parts of the world. And it's so interesting that one of the most popular growing sports, mixed martial arts, in the UFC, obviously been the main promotion within that sport, within that field. It's on show today, something that became popular amongst kind of high society women in Britain. It is quite a fascinating story of Jiu-Jitsu and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu today. Yeah, my story as well, one of my reasons you may know I broke my wrist, I broke my wrist doing Jiu-Jitsu, and I've also hurt my neck. So as much as an incredible sport, it is a martial art all the same. So there is some injuries involved, but one of the main benefits of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is you don't get head damage. You're not getting punched in the head, like there's no strikes as such. It's grappling, it's submissions, which is one of the reasons it's really caught on like wildfire, I think. A lot of super kind of smart intellectual people really get into it. It's almost like intellectual physical chess with some real world physical consequences in that respect. But obviously there's very safe ways to train it as well. I've just not quite been training the last year or so, just a few injuries I've caught up, and I don't really have time at the moment with making videos in between work, etc. But an incredible sport all the same, and like I say, there's definitely safe ways to train it in general, but if you're really wanting to get into it and really kind of sparring hard, etc., and competing, you know, there's damage involved to some degree, but the real benefit is there's not really too much damage for your brain. Unlike boxing, where you're getting punched in the head constantly, or other striking martial arts, it's pretty incredible. It's all you know, submissions, joint locks, etc., that are much less damaging to your brain. So yeah, that's one of the main reasons why it's became so popular. In 1918, the House of Lords gave approval for all women over the age of 30 to vote. In 1928, a decade later, all women over the age of 21 were given the right to vote, in line with male voting rights. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and hit the bell, and tell your friends and family about this channel. Please also check out my sister channel, Celtic History Decoded, which focuses more on Scottish and Celtic history. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.